Bryan Hehir, and I wish to welcome you all here tonight and to say a word about what we're trying to do. Basically, this is a forum we put together within the last 24 hours, and who's here and not here on the panel has something to do with that. We hardly reflect either the religious, the academic, the gender, or the ethnic diversity of the Divinity School. But I will tell you all about that, in case you hadn't noticed. I just wanted to be sure. And so I wanted to say, in the first instance, what we're trying to do, and even before I get to that purpose, to say that if there's a market for this, to put it in economic terms, or if there's an interest, to put it in academic terms, we will do more than one of these. Because precisely the resources of this faculty and this school and our visiting faculty would give us the capability to do more than one of these, several of these, if there is real interest. Now, what is its purpose? Well, I think the easiest way, we've talked about it as a time to think and talk from now till 7 o'clock. The easiest way to describe it is we're trying as an intellectual institution to provide an intellectual framework in which people can think, talk, dialogue, discuss the last week. Now, the roots that stand behind this past week are deep, extend across the globe, are multidimensional, and therefore it is not simply a discussion of the week in any sense of the term. But, as you know, we have multiple scheduled panels here at the school for this coming semester and speakers. This was catalyzed on an emergency basis, obviously, by the past week. So no more complicated than trying to set a framework for discussion and reflection. And in an uncharacteristic style for professors, we won't talk a lot. There has been limits placed on the presentations so that we can get out to you, so that we can talk together. So there will be short presentations that will catalyze, we hope, the discussion. I want to thank my colleagues who are here precisely because they were able, for various reasons, and willing to come and share their knowledge and their work under 24 hours, sometimes 12 hours notice. But I also want to bring you regards of people I asked to come, invited to come, and who for various reasons could not. But the reasons, to some degree, highlight dimensions of our school's life. We are here to talk among ourselves, to enrich our own sense of understanding. But we also have a school, as a school, have a wider public responsibility to seek to try and enrich the public discourse. And the reason people couldn't be here tonight is because several are doing that. Professor Leila Ahmed, Professor of Women's Studies and Religion, was invited by Senator Kennedy to come to Washington today with a number of other Islamic representatives to speak with the senator about what is the state of safety and life in the Islamic community here in the United States. Professor Cheryl Giles, Professor of the Practice in Pastoral Care and Counseling, in a week that has been traumatic for everyone, is on duty in the emergency room tonight of the hospital and could not be here. Professor Cornell West, University Professor, will appear on the Charlie Rose show tonight, in case you want to get Cornell's views. And Professor Diana Eck, who was originally scheduled to be part of the panel, called me today and told me that she had been asked to appear on the Bill Moyers show, a special show on tonight in New York, and there was no way she could do it from Boston. So a variety of different people who we can draw on for the future are not with us tonight. But we have a rich panel with us tonight, and therefore I would turn to introducing the panel, and then we will simply proceed down the table, if you will. My function is to moderate and make opening presentations, and then throw it open for you so that we can talk together and you can talk among yourselves. I will introduce people by alphabetical order, but we simply will speak as we go down the table. To my right is Professor Ali Asani, Professor of the Practice of Indo-Muslim Languages and Culture, a member of our faculty, and Ali responded in less than 6 hours to do this, so I am particularly grateful to him. Professor Peter Gomes is usually not that invisible, but he is. But Peter is coming. Peter is coming. I told him he only had 4 minutes to speak. I said, Peter, that's not the Baptist tradition nor your personal tradition, but that's all you get. The Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and the Pusey Minister in Memorial Church will be with us later. The end of the table on my left, Professor William Graham, Professor of History of Religion and Islamic Studies. To my immediate left, Professor David Little, Dermot Dunphy, Professor of the Practice in Religion, Ethnicity, and International Conflict. And to the left of David, Professor Robert Orsi, our new Charles Warren Professor of the History of Religion in America. Each of the panelists will approach the topic from a way they have defined, and then we will proceed with the discussion. So I invite Professor Graham to begin. I think you might need the mic.
I'm the only one who came with no notes or a prepared set of remarks, because I figured that I would probably not be first and would probably be everything would have already been said that I might say. So I was prepared to be flexible. So I'll start by being flexible. Let me just express a couple of concerns that we might follow up on in discussion and on questions that I have. That are very different and yet linked in some ways. One is one that I've been involved in already with several statements and with several groups in the yard, and that is the whole issue of the backlash that is happening already around the country, if any of you are following this. And I'm not talking simply about the fact that at least two people identified vaguely as somehow Asian or Muslim have been shot and killed in two different places in the country, but also that mosques have been fired upon and have been marched upon, and then there have been several hundred other incidents, as of this morning at least, of harassment of individuals who were identified. It's hard to say what they were identified with. One of the people killed was a Sikh who happened to be wearing a turban. One seems to have been a Pakistani filling station owner. And it's not clear whether it was skin color or clothing or what that identified people as somehow the target of a hate crime. I think that in our own community we would hope that we won't have any of this. However, a number of other colleges and universities have reported at least small incidents that are ugly. So that is one area of concern, something we could pursue if people would like to talk about that or have concerns about that. Second area that I think might be worth talking about is a longer-term thing. I myself am extremely concerned about what our government's response is going to be ultimately. I'm very concerned. I'm somewhat heartened by the fact that whether through ineptitude or actually patience and planning, that they have not made a move up to this time. I think that's a very good sign. And I don't know what the reason, but I'm very glad, and I hope that continues for some time longer. Because I guess I see this this crisis in the States. It's probably a crisis only because it comes all at once, and so many people killed in such a vivid and media-followed way. After all, around the world, and most of the third world, so-called, people are dying like this in any given week. Same numbers or larger numbers in equally horrible ways, but not so vividly and at the hands of a very small number of people. In any case, this sudden shock in our world, which has been a world in the last century largely unvisited by suffering at home, seems to me to be something that the rest of the world does have to live with and has had to live with pretty much around the globe. We in some ways have been remarkably immune. And I'm worried about in the long run that our response, rather than being measured in a way and being, let's say, internationally collaborative in a way that will lead to a better world 20 years from now, is that I'm terribly frightened that we could at this point overreact, or at least maybe wrongly react, and in fact induce more acts of terrorism, whether here or abroad or whatever, induce more feelings that must underlie at some level the possibility of groups like Al-Qaeda existing and growing, and that is that we could, by killing and maiming many more people, not be exacting revenge, but in fact escalating matters here and abroad that I think could be very, very unfortunate. So I simply throw that out as something that we might try to pursue and talk a bit further about. Those are the two things that I wanted to bring.
Bob Orsi.
Thank you, Bryan. I think this is a very important gathering tonight. I realize that it takes place in the midst of an ongoing conversation as part of a wider conversation, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. I want to quickly disclaim any expertise. I speak out of no expertise, but I speak out as a scholar of American religion and as a concerned citizen, and that's really the perspectives out of which I speak. I want to raise 4 points for our common discussion. The first is, I was deeply concerned, I don't know if anybody else shared this, I was deeply concerned by the memorial service in Washington. It troubled me in very deep ways, in particular by the mobilization of religious language in the public sphere and a kind of unchallenged intrusion of religious language into the public sphere without what I believe to be adequate attentiveness to the threshold, the boundary that we as a liberal democracy are meant to respect. And I came away from that with very, very grave apprehensions. People talk about the ways in which the bombing has forever changed the American landscape. I have to say that while that question, that's a very, very serious question, and I understand the question, I'm wondering how the memorial service has changed the American landscape as much, and how what the interplay of religion and politics after that service is going to look like in American culture. Secondly, in a related point, and this is connected, I'm worried about the ways in which religious language may be getting us ready for the very thing that Professor Graham is fearing. As I listen to this language unfold, Peter Berger's old concept of sacralization occurred to me, and I feared that we were beginning to sacralize national purpose. And the question then becomes, once our conversation has been sacralized, and once we've imported that much language into that much religious language into the public sphere, what happens to the possibilities of dissent? How have the boundaries, how have the possibilities and the horizon of dissent, genuine dissent, been narrowed by the reconfiguration of the conversation with this language, with this religious language? So that's the second point that I'm worried about. What's happened to our conversation? What's going to happen to the limits of dissent after the memorial service? And that brings me to the one part where I do feel like I'm speaking directly out of my training as an American religious historian, and that has to do with the comments made by Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. I took those very seriously. We shouldn't marginalize Robertson and Falwell. We should not pretend right now that they are marginal figures in American religion. And we shouldn't say, well, we can dismiss them because they're crackpots. In fact, as I've mentioned to one of my classes, both of them have sat down with presidents and had lunch with presidents. I haven't. So, I mean, who's marginal here and who's not? I mean, Pat Robertson has run for president. They're not idiosyncratic figures, and what they said was not idiosyncratic. What they said came out of a particular religious world, and we need to pay careful attention to what they said, how they said it, what groups they targeted, and what their comments might hold out as the danger to civil liberties in the future, depending on what happens in the next couple of months. It obviously is not accidental. I mean, look at the groups that Falwell targeted. He targeted homosexuals. He reminded us about homosexual rights. He talked about women and abortion rights. So women, homosexuals, and I at least heard the reference to the ACLU as a reference to Jews. So I think Falwell, those were dangerous comments made by a person who is not a marginal figure, who has a substantial congregation and a huge mailing list. And I think we need to think a little bit about the ways in which that alerts us to dangers to liberties that could be threatened by the current moment that we're in. Finally, I have questions about the nature of the university in this time. In general, what role do we have to play as particular kinds of sites on the American landscape? What are our responsibilities? I spent 2 nights ago on the phone for hours with the American Academy of Religion. I'm on the executive board of that, and we tried to hammer out a statement. And the question that really, it was a question that really occupied us for a very long time, and that is, what is our role as scholars of religion, what do we have to offer the country right now, to offer our communities right now, out of our identity, both as citizens and as citizens who are preoccupied with the study of religion? So I want to raise that with you as a question. How do you see, as people concerned with religion, with the practice of religion and the history and culture of religion, how do you see the university generally and your own role as scholars of religion, intellectuals of religion, serving as a resource for your communities in this moment? What can we do out of our own vocations? So, some things for us to think about.
David Little?
Right. I'm grateful to Bryan Hehir for convening this public discussion. It seems to me the events of this last week go right to the heart of what Harvard Divinity School is all about. What happened on September 11th brings us face to face with sacred matters. Acts of terrorism, particularly of the sort we witnessed on Tuesday, are violations of something we all regard as a taboo against the arbitrary destruction of human life. A taboo is a sacred prohibition. It is sacred in the sense that it is fixed and objective, not to be tampered with, and to be regarded with overpowering awe and unshakable respect. Violations of a taboo are sacred violations, and as such are unspeakable and unthinkable. On Tuesday, the taboo against arbitrary destruction was violated in the extreme. As would be expected, news commentators like we ourselves had deep difficulty finding words to describe or explain what happened. The events were literally unspeakable and unthinkable. The profound connection of Tuesday's events to the sacred dimension of human life undoubtedly accounts for the sustained and extensive outpouring of religious expression and participation immediately after the events and over the weekend. Religions are the natural, if not the exclusive, custodians of these sacred matters. At a fundamental level, their mission is to interpret and guide responses to sacred violations. The complication in this case, of course, is that the sacred prohibition against mass destruction was itself apparently violated in the name of religion. As best we can tell, the likely perpetrators invoked what might be called a sacred exemption from the standard Islamic prohibition against mass destruction. In one sense, that fact only reinforces this point about the relevance of the sacred, but in another sense, it deepens our perplexity regarding how we are to understand and cope with minorities in all religions, including Islam, who resort to terrorism on grounds of a special divine exemption from standard taboos. As best one can tell so far, the primary objective of Tuesday's attacks and the basis for the special sacred exemption that was believed to authorize them is the urgent need to unmask what is taken to be the truly diabolical character of the United States and its influence around the world. That can best be done by provoking the United States and its allies into a war against terrorism that gradually turns into a war among terrorists. The very means by which the U.S. defends itself, suspending civil liberties, intensifying war fever against terrorists, relaxing prudence and restraint in the use of force abroad, can themselves readily take on the image of terrorism. When and if that comes about, according to terrorist doctrine, the single superpower is then revealed for what it was all along, the super terrorist, namely a group or a country that is regarded as having power, that has for generations systematically and pitilessly violated the sacred prohibition against the arbitrary destruction of fellow human beings in ways that dwarf what happened on Tuesday. Such a conclusion would be the final vindication of the special exemption for Tuesday's attacks. Religious people will be called upon to give their responses to this kind of terrorist logic as they are individually and collectively moved to do. One reason for a discussion like this is for us to explore a variety of possible responses to this kind of logic. For myself, I do believe we face a national crisis perpetrated by people who are guilty of gross human rights violations. As such, they need, as do all gross violators, to be pursued very vigorously and possibly by means of force, though always in accord with human rights and humanitarian law standards. May I conclude by stressing one point of special interest. It is that the call for restraint, for care, for balance, for not being gripped by hatred, rage, loose talk, a passion for retribution, for thinking creatively about reducing conflict and about finding constructive means for building peace. And all of these things, of course, many religious people are these days uttering very fervently. All of these things, I'm suggesting, are in a most striking way reinforced by the nature of the very conflict, this new kind of war that we are engaged in. Lest we play into the hands of the terrorists by conducting ourselves according to their script, it makes good practical and policy sense, as well as good spiritual and moral sense, to be as resolute against adopting terrorist methods ourselves as we are in apprehending and resisting terrorists around the world. May this awareness guide our policy.
Before I pass on to Professor Asani, I have noticed out of the corner of my eye that Professor Leila Ahmed did make it back from Washington. And so... That in itself may be a moral miracle with the planes today, but I want to invite her, to come and take the empty chair, if she'd like, and I would be glad to give her time right after Ali Asani, or if this is undue and too quickly, we just call on you later, but come and have a seat, be welcome. Professor Ali Asani.
Okay. I actually have not anything prepared to really talk about, because as I had, less than 6 hours?
Less than 6.
And then I've been teaching in the meantime and on the phone, giving phone interviews and so on. So these last couple of days have in fact been nightmarish for me, because on the one hand, just like any other American, I'm traumatized by what has happened. And on the other hand, to be constantly called on to justify that, what is this connection with Islam? And I keep on thinking that if the IRA or somebody does something, scholars of Catholicism or Cardinal Laud and so on, nobody has to appear in public to explain that this has nothing really to do with the Catholic tradition. But what has astonished me is, of course, the levels of ignorance about Islam generally, and also I think the bigger concern for me has been, what does this mean, this event, given in the light of the backlash? What does it mean to be Muslim in America? How is this going to affect the history of the Muslim community here? Because these are very traumatic moments. And it's not just Muslims being, as victims of this backlash, but I think Muslims, on the one hand, have been directly affected because there were Muslims who were killed, in the World Trade Center. There were at least 2 Muslims we know who are actually innocent Muslims who were on the flights themselves, who died and had really nothing to do with it, but nevertheless they and their families were under FBI suspect list just because they were Muslim. And what does this mean for even other religious groups, the Sikhs? How is this healing going to take place in the Sikh community? The Hindu community also is being affected now. And for all these groups that are, recent sort of expressions of America's religious pluralism, right? Something that I think everybody was so proud of, that America is the most religiously diverse country in the world. And what concerns me is that some of the reactions actually shows that, well, have we really come to terms with this pluralism as a nation? Or is it just there superficial and we have all these subgroups existing side by side, but they're not being a real ethos of pluralism in the true sense of the word? I think the other thing that concerns me is, of course, the framework. I think we already talked about, the framework, how religion is being brought into play in many dimensions of this. I think it was 2-3 days ago, President Bush called this a crusade. And it astonished me that he could use such a word. Because, as you know, it has nuances of a Christian-Muslim encounter. And to frame this within this kind of an ideology, a crusader ideology, right, is, again, I think has implications not only for American Muslims, but it has also implications for what's going to happen in the larger world. As you know, that they're trying to get a coalition of different partners, some of them from Muslim countries like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and so on. And there is already internal opposition in these nations to collaborating with the United States against Afghanistan or whoever, or trying to apprehend Osama bin Laden. And this sorts of terminology, the use of this terminology, is highly inflammatory, because it just makes the task much, much more difficult, and introduces a religious framework into this whole conflict that really doesn't need to be there. Especially if we want to have an effective resolution of this crisis. And we want to have a non-violent and peaceful resolution that includes a broad-band coalition of people working against this. The third point that I want to make here is, again, something that many people are not so aware of: Osama bin Laden and his kind. There's, as I think people have been hearing the press, this is in fact a network that has different manifestations in different Muslim countries. And groups like this that have, in a sense, been terrorizing the Muslim world for many decades. They have been stifling pluralism within Islam. People have been afraid to speak out against groups like this because you could be threatened. And this is another whole dimension to this whole issue, and we see this, and of course the state gets involved in this as well. And there are, in fact, several Muslims have told me, talking to me personally, they said, well, one thing that we hope would be a very positive outcome of this tragedy would be that for once and for all, we get rid of this kind of individuals that claim to have that claim hegemony over discourse in Muslim countries about religious matters, and try to stifle any dissent or basically pluralist views, because many of these groups have monolithic interpretations of Islam, and they look at even fellow Muslims as targets if you disagree with them. And so I think my other concern is that how can we use this opportunity to in fact reclaim pluralism and freedom of discourse within the Islamic world, right? And not and somehow I'm concerned that, if this gets framed entirely within this Christian-Muslim crusade framework, right, it is really not going to solve anything, right? The problem is going to remain. Right?
Thank you. Leila? Professor Leila Ahmed, who, as I indicated earlier, is Professor of Women's Studies in Religion and has now been on our faculty and coming to us from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Welcome, Leila.
Thank you very much, Brian. And of course, I have no prepared comments. I've just arrived. And I think all of you, but in particular Ali, has given you a sense of every single one of these things could actually be analyzed further, the points that Ali raised. And I think maybe I'll just kind of try and, perhaps a little bit incoherently, touch on a couple of points that were raised. One is the whole issue is Islam, and I think I wish we would abandon the notion this has anything to do with Islam. It's any more than an abortion, a person who kills for abortion is therefore we have to talk about Christianity. In a way, to me this is not Islam. To every Muslim that I know, this is not Islam. And I think in a way we might be colluding and accepting the terms of the dominant people by calling it Islam. It's got nothing to do with Islam. There is a terrorist and they're nothing to do with Islam. They come from Muslim background, but really I suspect the motivations really about international politics far more than they are about anything to do with religion. So that's one element. A couple of points that, again, relating to what Ali raised, about the word that George Bush used, crusade, and I'm absolutely in agreement with you, but there's another element that I think we need to be aware of. At least in my own history in America, I have never witnessed the establishment paying as much attention to Muslims and actually making some effort, including Bush, and actually quite decent efforts. I mean, I think his visit to the mosque and the kind of things he said there, I certainly welcomed, and I think Muslims welcomed, and I think they were very important. And the media has, if you compare it to Oklahoma, there's been a huge advance. That's one level. The other level is also, although there have been attacks and there has been harassment, and some of them murderous, it's also the case, and this is true of everyone I've spoken to here and also at this meeting that I was at in Washington, that we are all very aware of a huge warmth of support of the local community to which we belong, so that these acts need to be seen in that perspective. And in that way, I would say that, Ali, your question about is America really plural, I think on the ground level, it actually is really becoming so. And I've been very, very moved by the kind of support that I've got, that I've witnessed, and I know that other people have got. Let me see if I think I had some other brief point that I wanted to make. Well, one of the things that was raised at the meeting today was what is going to happen to civil liberties, and in particular as they affect anybody who is Middle Eastern or looks Middle Eastern, because we see that it doesn't matter whether you are or not. You're very likely to suffer. And some of the people there were people who have been very actively fighting to stop the secret evidence on which Muslims have been held, or people of Arab or of Muslim background have been held without trial, without questioning, and this is about to begin to encroach very dangerously. So this was a major issue, and that was one of the things that most particularly that Senator Kennedy was very interested in attending to, perhaps.
Thank you very much. We are very welcome that you could come and do this on 3 minutes preparation. Just imagine what she does when she really puts her mind to it. Before I just go to the floor now, I wanted to say two things. We've heard a variety of topics here. We've heard about religion and politics, we've heard about international relations, we've heard about Islam, and we've covered a lot of ground. The one piece we haven't covered, and that Peter Gomes eventually will come and speak to us about, I think, is you might call it the pastoral dimension, at least from one religious tradition. There was a very interesting article in the Washington Post 2 days ago that I thought was interesting for a school of ministry, if you will, that said that while most of the media go to psychologists and psychiatrists to find out what the impact of this has been on people personally, where people go is to houses of worship. to churches, to mosques, to synagogues, and therefore the people in those houses of worship have enormously critical roles to play at a time like this. And Peter, I think, will be able to speak to that dimension. But I wanted to compliment my colleagues on restraint on all fronts. You had rich material but restrained amounts of time. We are now open for discussion. I'd invite you to raise your hands. We have a microphone. We are streaming this so that it goes on our website. So if you take the time to get a hold of the microphone, it will help. And also, I think if you would give us your name. This is the beginning of a year, and we can get to know each other, just what your name is, and if you're here at the school. So the floor is open. Yes, sir. Well, wait a minute. Let's see. The mic went in the other direction. We'll take you secondly. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Hassan al-Jabri. I want to ask the panel, as well as possibly Professor Graham, to comment on your advice to the American foreign policy makers and the American government, as well as the American people, to resolve this for the long term, not just the short term. I think we're all calling for restraint and so on, and the other comments, but for the long term, what do you think the American people and the American government should do? That's one. And within that same question, do you think there will be any changes, or there should be any changes in the American government's foreign policy towards other countries and other nations, given what this may have brought to light?
Bill, do you want to begin? Yours the only proper name used.
Well, as an historian of early Islam, I'm probably the least qualified person here to speak to that. But since I did raise this as an individual, as a concerned citizen, in my remarks at the beginning, I will make, I guess, again, two quick comments. One is that to your first question, it strikes me that the really critical thing in my mind is that anything that is done needs to be done in some kind of an international framework, the sort of thing that seems to be being started now. But I mean, it has to be seriously done that way. And whether it's the United Nations, which may or may not be capable of being the venue for this, or whether it is some kind of an agreed upon coalition, not like in the Gulf War, where there are those people who have been, dragged kicking and screaming or otherwise persuaded with inducements or whatever else to join the U.S. in its crusade, but rather that the U.S. would be a facilitator and obviously a motive force, but not necessarily somebody dragging the rest of the world or the rest of so-called civilized world, as someone said this week, into battle. I think that is what I think that one of the great dangers. Secondly, with regard to the question of U.S. foreign policy, I mean, any of us that work in the Middle East have, I don't know, if not given up. I mean, I don't think we've given up, because we still write letters and we still do things. But I mean, I think it's our foreign policy, at least in those areas of the world in which I work, I mean, ranging from the Mediterranean across to Indonesia, has simply been so sorely lacking and so ill-informed. And it's not, I really think, because of the lack of specialists in the State Department or elsewhere. It's really because of I think, the politicians who really don't have very much of a clue, by and large, about what the effects of their policies are. And even when they do things for absolutely, in their eyes, I mean, very good reasons, they wreak havoc in other parts of the world. And they, in fact, are perceived, and we are perceived, as a result, can be easily perceived as a quasi-terrorist nation of our own, simply because the kinds of things that we often support, inadvertently or advertently, are, I think, terribly, terribly dangerous in the eyes of many people around the world. So I don't know what the answer there is. I would like to think that perhaps something like this might lead to a wider sort of view of the world and of the U.S.'s place in the world. And what I'm frightened of is that it won't do that. I think that's what I started with.
The question was to the panel, so other people who wish to address this. David?
Just a quick word. I certainly agree with what Bill Graham says about the need for multilateral cooperation. As we're all aware, the Bush foreign policy has been developing in more or less an opposite direction, and this realization of the need for collaboration and cooperation is a very important slap in the face, if you will, to the administration, and one hopes very, very firmly that it will lead to genuine cooperation and collaboration. There are a few caveats that have been uttered by members of the administration to the effect that the U.S. reserves the right to act unilaterally. My feeling regarding that is it always should do, it probably will do that anyway, but I'm not quite sure I understand why that needs to be said in public. It always sets back, in a way, the kind of collaborative spirit that is allegedly being put forward. So that's a little worrying as a caveat in the direction you point out. A second thing I'd like to emphasize, I would think clearly settling the Middle East crisis, I mean the Israel-Palestine problem, is not going to eliminate terrorism. But I would think that if you could get movement in that direction, that is to say the U.S. administration, again, has been relatively removed and remote from the Middle Eastern question, and apparently now is, for these ulterior reasons, being drawn back into it. That seems to me a positive step, and if one could make forward motion on Middle Eastern policy, it would at least take one of the more obvious inflammatory points that the terrorists and so forth gain some traction on away from them. The third thing I'd like to mention is I hope that the U.S. administration will look at the experience of various governments around the world in dealing with terrorism. For example, Northern Ireland has a very mixed record. Britain in Northern Ireland has a very mixed record in terms of the use of torture and the so-called diploc courts, which were extraordinary courts indeed and led to, it seems to me, all kinds of abuses of due process. In other words, there is a range of experience out there, I have to say mostly negative, but it's the kind of thing internationally that the U.S., I believe, should be consulting and drawing lessons from. I haven't seen the slightest indication so far that they've been doing that. The last point I would want to make, it's not a foreign policy point, but it's a domestic policy. I would be very concerned, as I'm sure we all would, about the suspension of civil liberties in this country. And again, it's necessary that we look at our own history in regard to emergency situations in which the suspension of civil liberties has taken place. I'm thinking of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, the suspension of habeas corpus in the Civil War, the various espionage and alien acts during the First World War, and of course the detention that we're all aware of. That's not a good record. In fact, Justice Brennan once said there's much to be embarrassed about in the American response to emergencies. I would hope that the U.S. government would look at that record and draw the appropriate lessons.
Ali Asani.
I just want to add that I hope these events, get people, open up a public discussion really about what American foreign policy is about. Because I think people need to be questioning, why is there so much hatred? Why is there so much resentment against America around the world? What is it what's going on, and what are the implications? And maybe, given that we are a democracy, maybe questioning why certain policies are in place. So I'm hoping that takes place.
You will note that the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals has arrived. I'm going to take one more question so he can get his breath. Peter doesn't need time to get his breath to speak, but I am going to do that. And we will take one more question and then go to Peter and then go back to the floor again.
My name is Rajiv Malhotra from the Infinity Foundation in Princeton, New Jersey. My question is to Professor Asani. I agree that President Bush's use of Christian language was inappropriate. By the same token, I have heard almost every Muslim leader trying to explain the situation say, we worship the same God as the Christians, we believe in the same prophets, and we also believe Jesus was a prophet. So in a sense, invoking their membership of the Abrahamic religions, which is the use of religious language also, and which excludes Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, and all the non-Abrahamic religious people of the world. Do you feel, and this is the official line on the websites of Islamic groups, to really show that we are close to Christianity. Do you feel that that is also something that should be avoided by the Muslim leaders themselves, so that the kind of religion, whether it's close to Christianity or not, is not the criterion for acceptance?
I think Muslims in the West, because of all the stereotypes about Islam and looking at Islam as the other, in response to that, have in fact been trying, and this is not as a result of this crisis, this goes back, to the establishment of Islam within this tradition, and in fact even Muslim communities in Europe, to try to, because the other dominant religious traditions, there's a Christian tradition and then you have the Jewish tradition, and very often the experience of Muslims has been that Christians and Jews have often not recognized that that the Muslims actually share a common history, common prophets, and in trying to explain to people that Muslims are not the other, as you seem to project. Right? They invoke religious language and then start talking about scripture and so on. But I don't think that, because I think groups like the Hindus, the Sikhs, and so on, the Buddhists who are here in the United States, the Muslim community per se has, because they're not a hegemonic group, they're not the dominant group, has not really had to dialogue with them. Right? And the dialogue has always been Muslim-Christian. Right? And I think that is why it's taking on this format. But I agree with you that, we shouldn't be, the whole framework of what's going on, it should not be framed within religious terms, right? Because terrorism is terrorism. Right? It doesn't matter, who's doing it.
Well,
Peter,
I just want to say, actually, I agree with the question. I also agree with Ali. But I think one of the things that's happening as we talk about Islam in the way that we talk about labeling terrorism, Islam, or labeling, I think one of the things that's happening is that there is a huge erasure of the actual diversity of Islam and who speaks for Islam. So that people who are speaking in a particular way have actually become the spokespeople, and they hold to a particular view of Islam, which many of us, and I suspect from your comments, even you also don't entirely agree with, and yet these have become the spokespeople. So I do think there is a danger, but I think it's that Muslim organizations and the leaders of organizations that you mentioned have stepped into that position, partly to become the spokespeople of Muslims, but also, as for the reasons Ali said, to align themselves with the powers that be. So, but I do think it's a dangerous notion.
Bob Orsi.
This is a really hard point to make, and I'm uncomfortable making it, but I feel like I have to say it, and that is this. And I think I want to approach it obliquely because my knowledge of Islam does not permit me to say anything about that tradition. But I actually want to dissent, Leila, from something you said. And that is, you said that the bombing of abortion clinics has nothing to do with Christianity. When certain kinds of Christians bomb abortion clinics, that has nothing to do with Christianity. I actually really disagree with that. And I think that if we don't, it has nothing to do essentially with Christianity, because I don't think there is an essential thing called Christianity. But certainly if we ignore or overlook or downplay the specifically religious motivations of that violence, and here I'm only talking about abortion clinics, and I want to use that as an opening onto the question of religion and violence, I think those abortion clinic bombings do in fact come out of a certain kind of American Christianity that has in fact mapped the social landscape in a particular way, that does in fact demonize people and introduce the language of the satanic or evil into public debates, which in fact precisely forecloses the kind of dissent that I was talking about. So at least in that case, and I'm not saying anything about Islam here, I'm talking only about Christianity, at least in that case of the abortion clinics, religion and violence are inextricably bound, And I personally consider it part of our responsibility, here I'm speaking only as a scholar of Christianity, of American Christianity, of my responsibility to understand the subtle, intricate interplay of violence and certain kinds of Christianity in the United States. It's not to say that all Christians are violent. It's not to say that Christianity is inherently violent. It is to say, though, that the bombing of abortion clinics, in fact, does emerge out of Christian context.
Can I respond since he disagreed with me?
You can. But Peter Gomes is getting anxious over here, and so I don't want to have that visited on me.
No, I guess the only difference, I think I'm not actually in disagreement with you. What I'm really trying to bring out is that when somebody bombs an abortion clinic or kills a doctor in the name of Christianity, I don't think people come up to Dean Hehir and say, why do you believe these awful things? They know that there is distinctions and that some Christians will use a particular verse to mean particular thing, whereas the assumption is people will come up to me and say, why do you believe this? Why are you terrorists? You know? So, in other words, they are aware that there's a vast, Islam, like Christianity and Judaism, and probably most religions, but I won't generalize completely, it's made up of a text. You can interpret it in 600 million ways, you know. You can take a verse out of context. So.
Well, before I go to Peter, I ought to at least comment on that, because when the abortion clinic was bombed here in Boston, I felt an obligation that Sunday to preach on the basis that I oppose abortionism on moral grounds, and the church I belong to does. And I needed to distinguish opposition in principle to a particular moral question and the methods anyone can use in support of opposing, which of course is very much like the question of war also. And so I did feel the need to speak to that, and that probably does come with any religious tradition, but I'm here to moderate. And I will not try and moderate the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals, but I will be happy to introduce him and thank him for coming on 5 hours' notice to this. So, Peter, thank you very kindly.
Happy to oblige, and I do think that this kind of an occasion in this particular institution, along with other gatherings that have occurred in the last 7 days, has been a salutary bit of light in a context of great darkness and gloom. But I speak out of two concerns. The first is a pastoral one, which is my vocation, and the second is a policy one, which is mine as a citizen. Pastorally, as a Christian minister whose calling requires not merely the interpretation of texts, but the interpretation of behaviors and events and epochs, I am faced, as so many of my brothers and sisters in the Christian religious tradition are, with trying to answer a host of questions, only a few of which are related to some of the profound policy questions which would be addressed were we, for example, at the Kennedy School or the law school or the business school. And in some sense, those pastoral concerns about one's place in the universe, one's perception of the nature of God, one's relationship to God and to other people, one's sense of security and or insecurity, one's sense of being either a righteous victim or being righteously victimized. Those elements which cannot be dismissed from the great brew which is a part of this present set of concerns. And that therefore leads me to hope and wonder that as we enter uncharted waters for Americans, particularly young Americans, that there would be the internal resources, the spiritual and the intestinal resources to deal with things that we do not like to deal with, such as ambiguity and failure and frustration and the lack of an obvious foe and a definable course of action. In these days, it's become clearer than ever that although America may not be described as a particularly pious country, it is a country in which piety is inextricably bound up with public policy and the perceptions of public policy. So you cannot, it seems to me, separate out the religious dimensions and convictions of people from the behaviors of the government or the behaviors of those people with regard to anything that appears to be extraordinary. The policy question arises from the sense I have long had that ours is a country that in fact prides itself on the avoidance of complexity and does not know how to deal with genuine conflict. And one of the reasons that foreign news, so-called, is not frequently found on the front pages of major papers, with the possible exception of the New York Local, otherwise known as the New York Times. I asked the president of the Boston Globe once, why was it that the front page of the Boston Globe always led off with a story from Charlestown or Chelsea, or adventurously from Wellesley, and only below the fold or somewhere inside would there be a notion that there was some conflict going on, old routine conflicts in Ireland or the Middle East, or way behind the Filene's ads in Africa, sort of ho-hum. And he very pragmatically said, foreign news doesn't sell newspapers, at least in Boston. People here are not interested in foreign news because they equate foreign news with bad news. Only bad news from foreign countries is what you read about, and if you don't want to ruin your day or curdle your coffee, you will not read foreign news, which is why the Times doesn't sell as many papers as the Herald. So our avoidance of anything that is foreign, because it involves conflict and complexity, simply feeds in to the kind of dilemma we find ourselves in now, because these are complex issues involving tremendous tectonic conflicts, and which can be defined by much of our culture as essentially foreign, not us. Now here, this terrible complexity wreaks its havoc on our native soil with our huge icons in our own environment. And even then, if you notice, this is an intrusion of foreign enterprises, and if there is a way that we can sort of disconnect it from our natural way of doing things, we will do that. My hope is that out of this terrible set of circumstances and the trauma in which we find ourselves, where we actually are shocked into some thought, we might be able to seize moments like this in church halls and assembly halls and in high school auditoria across the country, actually to begin something that we have steadfastly avoided for 250 years, and that is a serious attention to the fact that we are a part of a much larger world and that our actions have serious consequences which no longer can be confined to other people and other places and other times. It is luxurious for us, in this most luxurious of institutions, to be able to have a kind of civil conversation like this. It happens every day. We pride ourselves. Bring interesting people, we will have interesting conversations. Hire brilliant faculty, you will have brilliant dialogue. That's what we do here. But this is so exceptional to the normal way of doing things in the country. My only great hope is that this short, sharp, terrible shock might change that across the landscape, and we might be able to begin anew.
Thank you very much, Peter. I am conscious that men have spoken pretty heavily. All the questions have been for men. I will give an affirmative action to women's questions. Marcia,
one of the aspects that's been hardest for people I've spoken to has been the quick move from being so saddened and so traumatized to suddenly all this jingoism and the patriotism. And I'm a little cynical about the possibilities of a complex dialogue under George Bush right now, and I hear a lot of complexity sort of in my leftist friends in the academy, and And I guess maybe a question for Professor Orsi is, what happens when something like the American flag feels like it stands for military violence and American aggression? What kind of symbols or what kind of words can people use who want to call for restraint and want to call for community and sort of realize the mourning but not back the military action?
Well, that's a really rich question. You're asking for the resources in American culture for responding. Are there alternate ways of being American in a time like this? Is that what you're thinking? There's rich traditions of dissent. There's a legal tradition that we could call on that I personally have been taking great comfort in, the notion that we could proceed through international courts, through law, through the tradition of law that's so important to this country, which has not always been successful, but in any case is something that we could hold on to. Within religious traditions, I mean, now is the time, and here I speak as a historian of American religion, now is the time to go back and discover Quaker texts and Quaker perspectives and abolitionist documents. I mean, there are rich American traditions of dissent and questioning and critical analysis that manage to be both authentic voices of this country's experience and at the same time dissenting. So, I think...
Anyone else wish to speak to that question? This lady in the third row back. If you'd give us your name, please. And
I just have a comment to make. I'm Harry Dayhouse, and a citizen of Cambridge. And I'm a citizen of Cambridge because I wanted once in my life to feel like I'm in the majority, and certainly I feel like I'm in the majority here. 3 weeks ago, I was in Cape Town, South Africa, during the racism conference. And on the news came Pat Roberts as a quoter from the United States. I'm very concerned that the powers that both Farwell and Roberts have in the press in the United States.
That was a comment. Now let me move to a question here, and then I think there was a question over here. Okay, question here, if you'd introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Manish Mishra. I'm a seminarian here at the Divinity School. I wanted to build on something Professor Graham alluded to. I'm a former Foreign Service officer, State Department employee, and my experience with the Washington foreign policy establishment is exactly as you alluded to, in that politicians make the decisions when it comes to foreign policy frequently not for right reasons, frequently due to vocal and interest groups that are able to exert pressure, and frequently due to public opinion. I'm very concerned right now about where American public opinion is. Certainly, having heard the comments of our panelists here today, other professors here at the Divinity School, my fellow seminarians, I think we as intellectuals, and I'd go even further to say liberal religious traditions in the United States, are in broad agreement in urging restraint, in urging careful thought before proceeding any further. But when I listen to the morning radio talk shows in Boston, or I go into an internet chat room, it is a completely different atmospheric altogether. The country, the general public in America, I fear, I suspect, has already decided that military action will occur and that the amount of force used will be whatever is necessary to subdue this threat and ensure that a scenario like this does not occur again. That is not restrained force. That is an unrestricted amount of force, whatever it takes to obtain the objective. I'm very concerned about this because with our last military intervention, for example, Serbia, there were public forums, there were debates to talk about this and decide how we would proceed. None of that's occurring now. The operating presumption in Washington, I fear, is that the American public is with this, they want us to take action, they're behind us. So my question is one of relevance. Here we are in academia, we're debating this. Are we only really able to influence this on the margins if our country has already decided where we're headed on this?
Bill?
Well, I will reply to that, though I'm not a Foreign Service officer. I think your perception, unfortunately, is quite accurate. We are very much on the margins. Even in Cambridge, we are on the margins. And it is very unlikely that if we hope to shape a public opinion that will conform to our views, we must concede, I think, right at the start that that is not likely to happen. So we have to, in some sense, accept the honorable but frustrating position of being voices crying in the wilderness who can vote and who may have a role to play. But because we ourselves have been persuaded that the world is waiting for our leadership, is no reason to believe that the world is waiting for our leadership, much less our country. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I watch the God channels on television as a form of Lenten discipline. I listen to the radios. I even read the letters to the editor, to even respectable papers like the Globe, and they are on a war footing. This is Remember the Maine. Professor Orsi will doubtless remember not only the high-minded positions of scrupulous religious minorities in this country. He will also remember that at every point, until there was no alternative, they were silenced, they were ignored, they were suppressed. It was not the abolitionists who won the Civil War. It was not the pacifists who won World War I, and so on and so forth. So we can either have the satisfaction of making honorable, consistent, and vocal protest in the hope that somebody might hear us without expecting to be able to actually shape things in a way that, alas, Robertson and Falwell can, because they have access not only to the president, they have access to the public pulse. That's what is so thoroughly distressing. And so I think in a way, we have to concede that. Otherwise, our depression at that thought, or our presumption, one or the other, will immobilize us even less, making us less capable of doing whatever it is that we can do. So I do not expect the president is going to say, what are they thinking at Harvard, before he decides what to do. Not even what are they thinking at Yale, as far as he is concerned. So in a sense, waiting to be called upon is probably not the right stratagem. It is, in whatever corners that we may be, by whatever means available to us, we will have to make ourselves heard, and accept the fact that that might not always be the way we would like to be heard.
Dave Little?
One quick point and then a kind of double-sided comment. One is we certainly, I would think, can have some impact upon some senators in our midst. It's been alarming to me the degree to which even the liberal senators in the U.S. Senate have simply caved in. And I would think, on second thought, some of those people will reconsider. So there is a beachhead, you might say, and I think it's one that those of us concerned about these questions would want to try to exploit. The double-sided comment I wanted to make in response to the question about U.S. policy is this. I think there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is that, as I suggested in my comments, that the nature of this conflict almost requires restraint, and you're beginning to see the consequences of that in respect to the formulation of policy. You may have noticed in the press this morning, bombing sites in Afghanistan are not exactly rich, and therefore the planners are having to reconsider and think new thoughts about that. And it's being brought home to this administration that if you push too hard on Pakistan in order to get them to cooperate, there will be hell to pay within Pakistan, and you may lead to huge fragmentation and divisiveness in Pakistan, etc. And these people are not absolutely stupid, it seems to me. They are capable of understanding those things, and the deeper they get into it, the more difficult it comes to pass, the more difficult it is to find a kind of consistent and rational policy in response to it. That's the good news. And I'm trying to say the nature of the conflict dictates certain restraint and care that we can take some objective heart in. The bad news is that this kind of frustration, that you look here to Pakistan, you can't do much, Afghanistan can't do much, Syria can't do much, leads you perhaps in frustration to do something irrational and stupid. That's the thing that really worries me most of all. At the end of this kind of increasing analysis may come frustration and the need to meet the kind of war rhetoric of the American population and so on. So I'm deeply, but I don't think it's all one way, quite frankly. I think it's a rather more complicated, even from a policymaker's point of view.
Bob Orsi, and then we are going.
Two quick comments, one in response to something Peter said, and then Manish's, I want to respond to Manish's angst over the question of universities. I agree, Peter, that I would say that no war in American history has been fought that has not been declared a holy war first, with the possible exception of the Revolution, but even that I don't think is exempt from this. Every war that has been fought has been declared a holy war. Now's the time to rediscover a wonderful old book that I read in graduate school called Preachers Present Arms, which was written in the 40s, and it painstakingly details the incredible involvement of America's clergy, conservative and liberal, in the grotesque preparations for America's entry into the First World War. Just a shocking book, and without restraint. Religious figures have often behaved without any restraint in those moments, so you're absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons why the turn to religious language has concerned me. As to your angst about universities, I mean, someplace between grandiosity and we have to find a path. And I've been feeling Reinhold Niebuhr tapping me on the shoulder now since last week. And I think this is in the spirit of Reinhold Niebuhr. Someplace between grandiosity and despair. We have to find a sense of where the universities are right now. I mean, friends of mine, I mean, it's true that Bush, you know, he paid no attention when he was at Yale. There's no reason he should be paying attention to us now. That's true, fair enough. I mean, but I can tell you that having come just from a state university, a huge state university, Indiana University, where there's 45,000 students, friends of mine in Indiana are organizing panels like this at Indiana, and I've heard from friends of mine at the University of Florida, University of Arkansas, University of California system. They've all been organizing this. So it's not completely true that universities can have no impact, because in fact a tremendous amount of the public does pass through our doors, and they sit in front of us every day, and we have tremendous access to the public. So while I appreciate your tempered question, at the same time, don't despair.
Gentleman in the back, in the right left-hand corner.
A long-fellow visiting scholar of the Divinity School this year from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Well, I think as the issue, I've been only in this country for 3 weeks, and I think I was so shocked by the incident, but at the same time, I was so shocked that, as you said, this incident related to the foreign policy of this country. But as Professor Gomes has observed, there's no news in the television of foreign news. I was so shocked for the last 3 weeks, even for this incident, all the news are about the Americans' response, but no response from outside America. The only picture I've seen was those youngsters at West Bank of Palestine. They are so happy. And that seemed to me was the only foreign pictures in the news and the television. So I was so shocked. Why should that kind of picture be as kind of from the foreign lands? And in fact, when we're talking about a foreign policy and they are so much affected by public opinion, but the people of America seems not so much interested in those responses from foreign countries and foreign people. And I think as a university, intellectual community, how to make people in this country to be aware, not only the American is the center of the whole world. As a Chinese always think as our name, the center of the whole world, Well, when we're talking about the foreign response, that kind of, when those children saw the two World Trade Center hit by 2 planes, this picture repeated, so many times in the television. So I think the public opinion just simply thinks, we were the victims, and we were just, we must have to act militarily. And I think, why those children so happy? They just saw just like Goliath hit by 2 stones of David. Well, but that is not the true picture for the foreign countries. So I think if we are really concerned about our foreign policy of this country, unless, the public are so more interested and also aware or take into account the response from the foreign countries and people. Thank you.
Dorothy Zinberg, I think, had a question behind him, and then down here to this lady, and over here, and we are at 10 minutes to 7, and I am under sacred obligation to have you out of here between 7 and 7:05, so this probably is going to wrap it up. Dorothy?
Yes, I just wanted to ask, if the panel could foresee something, a form of a peace movement arising out of linking student groups across the country, what could be the role of the Divinity School, because they had a very strong role during the anti-Vietnam protests, and what would you see as the issues that should be addressed so that people can be in touch with each other with a common framework?
That was addressed to the panel.
No.
I don't get any takers, Dorothy, right at the minute. All right, Leila?
It's not to answer your question. I don't know what they can do, but I think what I've been experiencing is the number of people who want to do something. So I would urge you to get together with other people and think about what to do, because I've had this question come at me from so many people of what it is that we can do, and therefore there's the energy to do something. So pursue it.
I think my caution, however, would be, particularly for those of us of a certain age, not to assume that the anti-war movement of the 60s and 70s is a slumbering giant waiting to be wakened to new service by a new generation. I think the generation of college students with whom I deal is very, very different from the students 25, 30 years ago, and one cannot necessarily assume that there is a commonality of interest simply because the cohort from 18 to 22 or plus happens to be in residence in the thousands of American universities. And I think there are many mixed sentiments percolating in the colleges and universities among the young, everything from a kind of rabid USA, bomb them back to the Stone Age kind of football mentality, to indeed things very similar to the sense either of self-interest or moral outrage that characterized much of the old anti-war movement. But I think we have to find a new paradigm, both for protest and witness. And I think we would make a very serious cultural mistake equating the anxieties and concerns we might have in the present circumstances with the kind of cultural tag of the anti-war movement or the protest movement. Those, I think, are locked in a particular cultural moment, which is not a moment that is easily resurrected now. In fact, might even be counterproductive.
Question here, and then I have, I'm going to ask you with the microphone over here after that.
University of Virginia, anthropology, and a fellow here, and I see a large meeting. I see Harvard Divinity School. Can we not make a resolution here and now against revenge, favoring care and patience, and to work with the international community over this? Simple thing. Can we make a resolution? I propose it.
I think, to be honest, I think we've held the discussion, and I wouldn't try and make a resolution in the last 3 minutes. I think there may be other discussions, but it does seem to me we need to talk about, what you want to do. I do think we ought to keep the character of the discussion as it's gone forward. People can do all sorts of things in the school, but I think it would be best to keep the character of the discussion as it's been.
Hi, my name is Moan Anathan. I'm a Div student here, and I happen to take perhaps a different viewpoint than what we have heard tonight. I think that, first of all, with respect to the innuendos about senators caving in, the American flag carriers meaning war, military might, the whole question about irresponsible, unrestrained behavior. there's a different side to that also. I mean, people carry the American flag because they love America, not necessarily because that means war or guns or whatever. And to the same extent, I mean, I think our senators are only doing what they believe is prudent for the short term and for the long term. I'm convinced they understand the problems, perhaps much better than we do. And it bothers me. It bothers me to hear so much concern about the things that we shouldn't do, or the things that we believe the country is going to do in a negative way, without talking about the other side of the equation. I also think that while I agree that we need to be careful about the rhetoric we use so that we do not inflame, I'm inclined to believe that this is a religious war. It is a holy war. And just as the spokesman of perhaps the far-right Christianity, those that you mentioned tonight, speak for many Christians, and even though that is just a sector, a component of the Christian community, does not mean that they are not Christians and that they do not have the Christian value in their sense of their war. The Muslim community, in my estimation, is one that, who speaks for the Muslims? Is it the Ayatollah? Is it bin Laden? Is it the head of Pakistan or Iraq or Iran or Syria? Is it Arafat? I mean, these are the people, these are the charismatic people who speak on behalf of Islam. And to some degree, while they are not all fanatics for sure, there is that element, as there is in the Christian community, a fanatic branch, religious branch, that has declared war on the United States. They have, and to that extent, it's my sense that this is a religious war on their part. They are attacking a multicultural, multi-religious community, which is the United States, and I just feel that this, in fact, is a holy war, and we ought to treat it as such.
The panel, this has cut across things that are said on the panel. Does anyone on the panel wish to respond? Okay. 2 minutes. The next gentleman, and I have one more question over here, and that's all I'll be able to take. But I'm going to ask whether you want more of these. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
I wanted to ask a quick question about the role you may see, I guess, particularly Professor Little and maybe Professor Ahmed, for religion to play in a world that's not just confessionally plural, in terms of course, recognizing multiple faiths here in the States and abroad, but structurally plural with respect to different institutions, businesses and families and governments and so forth. Took part in a conversation at the Kennedy School this afternoon where Michael Ignatieff made the argument that that on two fronts, the State Department and the media broadly in the last several years, like the last decade, seems to have scaled back significantly in light of the opportunities that the web provides for just citing foreign stories from the news media's perspective or drawing on others. Is there any way, perhaps, like Professor Hehir was saying about the ways that religious groups here in the States have helped us to cope, that religious organizations abroad may help on either of those two fronts, foreign policy for the State Department or a more accurate level of reporting in the media?
I think it is the case, in my experience in Washington, that the State Department, going back into the 90s, the late 90s, began to develop considerable sensitivity about the role of religion in regard to U.S. foreign policy. And actually, I was present at a number of gatherings where American Muslims and representatives of other religious groups who had ties and connections abroad were invited to the State Department and asked to reflect on U.S. policy, what was good, what was bad, and how religion, as a matter of fact, could be useful to, insofar as they were in agreement, could be useful to the development of a more tolerant attitude both in this country and abroad. That is, how could the U.S. alter its policies that would take into account pluralism, multi-religiosity, and so on. I think it is true to say that spirit is to some degree present in the State Department, and however, it's hard to say whether it's had much impact on U.S. policy. That's where I'm much less clear. I think the State Department and many of the people who think thoughtfully about these things have rather good ideas, but when it gets translated into policy, it's much less clear. You may remember that President Clinton initiated the bombing of the pharmaceutical factory in Sudan near Khartoum after the Tanzania and the Kenyan embassy destruction. And he did actually preface his comments about the policy by indicating he understood that Islam was not monolithic, it did not represent a war and so on, but nevertheless we were identifying, targeting particular groups of Muslims. The trouble was, or groups of terrorists actually, the trouble was that policy was misguided in my view, and the launching of that cruise missile, which had then terrible repercussions from the area. And so you can be as aware as you want to be getting that message through, but when it comes to designing particular policies, if they don't go well, if they don't fit within a reasonable framework, then all of that stuff is undone. So it's that complexity that I'm trying to point to.
Final question of the night or comment.
Yes, Karen Harris, MDiv student here at the Divinity School, and I'd like to thank all of you. I'm so grateful to be here and to hear this kind of measured and reasoned discussion that we've not been able to find either in the media or from our government, and I thank each and every one of you for presenting us this material. I'd like to pick up on what was raised here at the back of the room. As I know we've all just searched our hearts for the last week for some framework of meaning and understanding, and one thing that's come up for me in my contemplation of these events is an idea of a civilians' rights movement, paralleling the civil rights movement, a movement that would take into account not only the loss of life at the World Trade Center, but to focus very specifically on the potential loss of life in other countries as we consider, as a country, how we respond. And I would love to know what any of you might think about this as a possibility for a framework for a movement that could hopefully transcend international boundaries.
You referred to it as a civil rights movement?
The danger to
civilians' rights movement focused on the rights and the lives of civilians, whether they're in Afghanistan or in New York City.
No. Well, I can only second the idea. I think it's excellent, and many of these ideas that are being put forward as to what we can all do, I think are extremely significant. They require a good deal of further thought and action. A group of students proposed to me yesterday the idea that we need a group of liberal religious leaders and academics who will initiate an ongoing discussion, not simply make a statement and let it go at that, but an ongoing, you might call it a monitoring activity in which, as the U.S. policy and the international policy unfolds, that there would be critical response, supportive response where indicated. I think that's an excellent idea. As we talked it through, it has practical problems. All of these things have practical problems, take energy, take money. I don't want to throw cold water on these things, but they are difficult to initiate, and it's not always clear which combination of people and all that. My own feeling about the response, I see the possibility of a real division in this country, which in some ways might parallel the Vietnam era. That is to say, the rest of the country, as has been described today, echoing the rhetoric that we've heard on the media and in Washington, but liberal groups like this one across the country, repeated again and again in universities and liberal religious organizations, taking a very different view, almost two civilizations, a kind of culture war, as it were. That seems to me something to be very, very concerned about. Not that it would be bad if that kind of movement developed, but I would think that we'd want to try to build bridges and, in the proper spirit of peace, at least in the initial stages, find ways not just to polarize, but to reach out and have some kind of effect upon people with a different perspective. So I worry a little bit about the sort of in-groupness of a response and the fact that it may divide the country and not really help to, in the short run anyway, provide the kind of more thoughtful interaction that we might desire.
Okay, we have had a quite disciplined discussion, I think, and one of the questions I want to ask is how many of you are interested in doing this again? Really interested, so you'd show up, because I have great hesitation to ask people to come, be prepared, and all of that. Well, and we will look into that and see what the possibilities are and look into other things. I want to thank the panel for great discipline and at the same time... And I want to thank you all for coming. We know you have multiple things to do, so God bless and go well. Good.
Wonderful. Delighted to be here. Oh, an idea I have.
Well, it's good. I mean, I think some of the dimensions